All right, you are live.
Hi there, my name is Lisa Andreano, and I'm an environmental scientist for California State Parks. I work in the San Luis Obispo Coast District, which is located in central coastal California. And today I'm going to talk to you briefly on an introduction to fire ecology. So I always like to start my talks by asking a question. So just think about this for a second. I want you to think about what fire ecology actually is and defining that term. So hopefully you came up with something similar to this. It's really a mixture of fire and ecology. So the study of interrelationships between living organisms, their environment, and a natural process called fire. So there's some different kind of key principles into the study of fire ecology. One of them is that all ecosystems change over time. We call this succession. Fire ecology recognizes that natural fires and prescribed fires are an agent of change and regeneration across the landscape. And in particular, in California, many ecosystems have evolved with fire as a natural process caused by lightning strikes. And that many California species are uniquely adapted to fire. This is very much the case in California. Most plant communities have evolved over time and have specialized adaptations to surviving or regenerating after fire, but it has to be a certain type of fire. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So there's some elements to fire ecology that we need to get out on the table. First, we have to look at the actual physics of the fire. So the type of fire, the energy release, the combustion process. There's the fire behavior, and this is really how the fire is acting on the landscape. So is it rushing up a slope, or is it slowly backing down a slope? Is it flanking across a slope? Is the wind affecting it? How are the fuels affecting it? What's the rate of spread? And different things like that, severity, intensity, residency time. There's also this concept of fire regimes, and fire regimes we're going to get into here in a second, so I'm going to save that definition. And then the fire effects. So these are the effects that the fire have on the natural organisms in the system. And then the other element to fire ecology is how we manage fire. So this is both in the wildland fire setting as well as the prescribed fire and fuels treatment setting. So as a fire ecologist that works for state parks, I have to consider all of these things. So fire regimes, this is a really interesting concept, and really it's how California ecosystems are specifically adapted to particular types of fire behaviors at specific return intervals. So this is saying that most systems in California have adapted to a type of fire at a certain return interval, meaning a certain amount of time between natural fires. So maybe a natural fire return interval in a redwood understory would be a very frequent low intensity fire. That's an example of a fire regime. There's some characteristics that we use or terminology to describe fire regimes. In particular in California, these are temporal characteristics such as the frequency of the fire, the seasonality even of the fire. Are fires natural in that landscape due to lightning strikes maybe in the fall versus the summer? There's some spatial characteristics to fires and fire regimes. There's the actual size. Maybe a typical area is used to burning a vast amount of landscape, or maybe it's a little bit more small and patchy. So patchy gets to the complexity, which is another spatial characteristic of fire. Is it a patchy fire where there's a lot of unburned fuels left behind, or is it a very complete fire where everything's been consumed? There's the magnitude of the fire. So this gets to the intensity, the severity, the residency time, and then the fire type. So is it a ground fire or a surface fire? Is it an aerial fire in the canopies of the shrubs and trees? So here's a quick look at some basic fire regimes that we have here in the West Coast of the United States and even into British Columbia. There's an understory fire regime, which would be fairly low intensity and fairly frequent with maybe just a few trees torching, but a lot of kind of cleanup of the understory fuels and like decaying plant matter. There's a stand replacing fire regime where all the adult trees and shrubs are burned And what's left in the regeneration process is a bunch of babies, basically baby trees and shrubs. So there's an understory, stand replacing, and then something we call a mixed severity fire regime, where you see a little bit of both of those things across the landscape. So that's the lower picture on the right. Basically, you're seeing some areas where there is a stand replacing canopy fire, as well as those green patches where there was just an understory fire. So let's talk about what's happening to fire regimes in California. And I'm hoping you can give this some thought. I mean, right now, as I'm giving this talk, there's fires all across the state and even into Oregon. We're seeing a lot of fire and fire behavior across the landscape. So what's happening to our fire regimes in California? And really, there's two big things happening. I'm not even talking about causes. I'm just talking about fire regimes. So in Southern California, we're happening to see an increase in the fire return interval, meaning that fires are happening more frequently than they have ever happened across the landscape. And part of this has to do with just humans moving into the wildland urban interface. And along with humans comes things like cars that can spark a fire on a rock, or with a hot catalytic converter when they pull over on the side of the road, or down power lines, or unattended campfires. There's so many things that can cause an increase in our fire return interval. And we're seeing that a lot in Southern California. This is a picture of Southern California Chaparral from the Santa Monica Mountains. And in the background on the left, you can see that that Chaparral stand burned in 1970, and it's regenerated very well. Typically, Southern Chaparral burns every 100 or so years, so fire isn't very frequent across the landscape. In the middle of this picture, you can see that that patch burned not only in 1970, but again in 2001. And just with the color and the texture of the plants in the photo, you can see that it's very different. So what's happened here in this middle section, where the Chaparral burned twice within about a 30-year period, is that it burned too frequently and the chaparral hasn't fully recovered. And there's quite a few reasons why that would happen. And then in the foreground, on the lower right-hand side of that photo, you can see that that patch burned in 1970, in 2001, and again in 2003. So this particular stand of chaparral has burned way too frequently. There's no recovery of native species because they weren't probably reproductive by the time they burned again. This is what we call type conversion of a landscape because of too frequent fire. So here we're actually seeing that the chaparral is burning too frequently and we're losing it to things like invasive weedy species. So that's what's going on in Southern California. And in the Sequoias and in Northern California and throughout the Sierra Nevada, we're seeing a decreased fire return interval. So this is a picture from Giant Sequoia area. And I want you to notice in the picture on the left, if you look really closely at the base of those giant sequoia trees, you'll see human figures kind of for scale. And you'll notice it's very, very open between those trees. On the picture on the lower right, that's the same tree that you're seeing on the left-hand side of the left photo. So that big kind of triangular cat face in the sequoia. That happens when fires go through and kind of burn out parts of the trunks of the trees. This happens to redwoods and sequoias very commonly. And you'll notice that that's the same tree, but the understory is now filled with a bunch of young trees. And those aren't young sequoias. Those are trees that are better at kind of reproducing in their own shade in the absence of fire. They're likely a bunch of different types of firs and maybe even some cedars. So what we've seen here with the decrease in the fire return interval is that the understory of the sequoia forest is filling up with plants that are okay with shade. And we're not seeing that kind of frequent fire that the sequoias or redwoods would have been adapted to. Additionally, with all this understory fuel, it's going to affect the type of fire behavior you're going to see in that sequoia forest. The picture on the left, you'll notice that there's not a lot of those understory trees or what we call ladder fuels. And so the fire is going to stay on the ground and it won't have a very long residency time or a lot of intensity or severity compared with the picture on the right after fire seclusion. I like this picture a lot. I use this when I teach dendrology or dendrochronology, which is kind of looking at fire across the landscape, especially in forested habitats. One thing that we look for in dendrochronology is fire scars to help us understand a fire history. So this is a cross section of just part of a giant sequoia tree. And each of these arrows with a date is indicating a fire scar that's left behind on the rings of this tree. So what this tells us is 1245, 1261, 1277, 1291, each of these years there was a fire. And this was, before we had European settlements in California. So this would have been natural fires or even Native American caused landscape management fires. So the fire return interval here was every 20 to 30 years. We can see that by the evidence of fire scars in the trees. So I think my point with this is that in the redwoods and the mountainous and forested regions of central and northern California, we're seeing a change in the fire return interval from low intensity fires every 20 or 30 years to these catastrophic fires that we've been seeing in the last handful of years here in California. All right, so that was a little bit on fire regimes and how they are changing across the California landscape. And for a variety of reasons. I want to get into fire effects now. So this is kind of the meat and bones of fire ecology. This is really how fire is affecting the abiotic and the biotic elements of the landscape. So the abiotic, if you'll remember from maybe your high school science class, is the physical environment. So the non-living, not the plants and the animals, the non-living physical environment, things like soil, water and the water cycle and air even. And then there's the biotic organisms or living organisms such as the plants and the animals. So now we're going to kind of talk about this, the effect that fire has on both the abiotic and the biotic environment. We'll start with the abiotic environment, and we're going to talk in particular first about soils. So fire has quite a few different effects on soils. It can change the soil chemistry. It can change the temperature of the soil, not just by the fire passing across the landscape or the soil surface, but if there's a lot of severity and a long residency time, the temperature in the subsoil surfaces can actually be impacted. The other thing too, if you notice in this photo that most of the vegetation, this was a pretty severe fire, most of the vegetation is completely burned down. And so what you're seeing is that there's actually more sunlight or solar radiation hitting the surface of the soil. So that can change the temperature. You can get a loss of soil structure because of all the organic matter and the microbes and the microorganisms in the upper soil horizons can get cooked off. You can even see with high intensity or high severity fires, the formation of a water repellent layer that can really reduce the infiltration. Now, infiltration is how water can get down into the soil. Think of the soil as a sponge that can absorb the water. And after some fires, you'll see a water repellent layer kind of form on the surface of the soil so that when it rains, the water can't actually absorb in like into a sponge, but it runs off the surface like water hitting a piece of glass and running off the surface of that. This can lead to whole-scale erosion, and this is something that we're very concerned about as fire ecologists and fire managers, is the erosion of sediment into our streams and even landslides that can be caused that can impact communities. There is a post-nutrient release of beneficial chemicals that happens in the soil environment. So you can see nutrients like phosphorus and calcium and magnesium and carbon, and sometimes even nitrogen getting added back into the soil. So in a sense, fire can be a good fertilizer to the soil. And those chemicals or the increase of those chemical contents in the soil can actually persist for up to 5 years after a fire. So fire is a regenerative source in most cases, especially under natural fire regimes with appropriate fire behavior and return intervals. You can actually see a lot of benefits to the soil after a fire, which can then benefit plants and animals. All right, now we'll talk a little bit about fire effects on the water cycle. So I kind of alluded to some of those effects with erosion and how that can impact our creeks and streams. So I want to break this down into things that we see decrease in the water cycle because of fire and things that we see increase. So with decreases, we're going to see less rainfall interception. So rainfall interception is really the ability of a plant or sometimes even a structure at basically intercepting the raindrop. If you have raindrop on just bare soil, it's kind of like a bomb going off. All these micro soil particles can kind of explode everywhere. And so plants are really good at intercepting the rain and kind of decreasing some of the force behind that raindrop. So we see a decrease in rainfall interception. because we have vegetation that's burned off. So there's not as much stuff shading the soil surface or protecting the soil surface from the incredible force behind those raindrops. We see a decrease in infiltration. So again, this is the water actually going into the soil like water goes into a sponge. We're going to see less of that because we have less interception. And sometimes we have those hydrophobic layers that form on the soil. We'll see less evapotranspiration. Now, evapotranspiration is when a plant is basically breathing. It has its stomatal pores or cells open for gas exchange that's required for photosynthesis. Sometimes plants will lose their water to the atmosphere while they're photosynthesizing. And that whole process is called evapotranspiration. It's one of the ways that water goes from a plant back into our atmosphere. And we'll see less of this after a fire simply because we have less leaves and vegetation around in the immediately the post-fire environment. We'll see decreases in suitable aquatic habitat for sensitive aquatic species, such as certain insects like the Ephemeroptera, the Trichoptera, and the Plecoptera. It's mayflies, stoneflies, and I'm forgetting the other one, and certain things like newts or even breeding fish that require very clean water. We're going to see that habitat decrease because we're going to have soil and sedimentation going into the creeks. So for a short amount of time, we might see a decrease in suitable aquatic habitat. So fire effects on the water cycle where we see increases to things. We're going to see an increase in snow accumulation and the rate of melting. And this is again because the overstory vegetation has been removed. So instead of those trees gathering some of that snow, keeping it up on the branches and boughs of their trees as opposed to just all on the ground, you know, those trees have burned, so we're going to see more snow accumulate on the ground. Also because there's probably less overstory shading the surface of the forest floor, we're going to see increases in rate of melting of that snow at high elevations just because it's exposed to more solar radiation. This can lead to downstream flooding, which has happened here in California in years past when we've had severe fires in the Sierra Nevada on a very large spatial extent. We'll see more overland flow and runoff of both water and soil sediments. And again, this is because of all the things that we talked about in the previous two slides. There's just less vegetation to trap the soil. There's more erosion and runoff because there's more exposed soil, and some of that soil has a water repellent layer. So this can lead to surface erosion and sedimentation downstream, as well as turbidity. This is kind of the cloudiness in our water column in our creeks and rivers and streams. We're going to see an increase of nutrients into creeks, and this isn't necessarily the best thing. Like it's really great for the soil, but it can be really bad for creeks and streams because these increased nutrients can lead to algal blooms, and algae can take up a lot of the oxygen and block a lot of the sunlight that creek critters really need. We can also see increases in water temperature. And again, this is because of the more direct solar radiation, because a lot of the overstory might have been burned, but also because we have a bunch of sediment filling up those creeks now, the water column isn't as deep. So there's a shallower profile of water, which means that it can heat up more quickly. All right, so that was kind of an overview on some of the effects that fire can have in the short term on our soil and our water. Let's talk about air quality for a second. So in the short term with a fire, we're going to see smoke for sure in the air. And this includes ozone and particulates. I mean, for the last 3 or 4 weeks here in my neck of the woods, I've either been smelling smoke or seeing smoke because of the fires that are going on throughout California. I mean, the Bay Area, and in Oregon, the sky was straight up orange for days because of all the smoke and the particulates in the air. There can be short-term impacts to the health of firefighters as well as the public. I mean, think about the people that are in those fires directly fighting the fire, where they're breathing in really deeply as they're hiking or working. And then of course we can have impacts to the public. There can be impacts to visibility, which can cause traffic accidents. So we have to be really careful about that. And then there's short-term impacts to smoke dispersal. So sometimes when you have a lot of fires going on, depending on the time of year, the mixing height or the mixing column of the air just isn't as high. And so you can get kind of smoke like kind of slowly sinking at night. We'll get a nighttime inversion. And so we'll see that dispersal of smoke really decreases at night, or seasonally there'll be less mixing, so there'll be less dispersal. There can be long-term impacts for sure to air quality. I would say that with the wildfires we're seeing today, we're probably producing more long-term impacts because of the smoke than we would with prescribed fire. So prescribed fire puts up small pulses of smoke over a day or a week, where these large catastrophic wildfires that we're seeing today that are kind of atypical of a natural fire cycle are producing, you know, just huge air quality impacts over weeks and months. Additionally, the use of prescribed fire in forest management can help maintain and create resilient forests, which can then be carbon sinks, which could help us with our long-term air quality issues that we face today. All right, so that was really fire effects in a nutshell on the abiotic elements of our ecosystems. Let's talk about fire effects on the biotic elements, or the plants and the animals. So we'll start with plants. Most California communities are adapted to fire. There's a couple exceptions to that. You know, your seaweed rackline along the strand of a beach isn't going to typically burn. Our desert communities, under a natural fire regime before we had the introduction of non-native weedy grasses, they didn't really burn because lightning would strike and there would be so much space between plants because of the competition for water that the fire wouldn't really spread. Even if it was wind driven, you would just get patchy bushes occasionally burning. Now all the open space in the desert is filled in with annual invasive grass species, and that grass can carry fire from shrub to shrub to shrub. So with the exception of the deserts and some of our strand and four-dune plant communities, most plant communities in California are adapted to some type of fire at some frequency. So a lot of these plant communities have individuals that can resist fire damage, that can persist in the face of fire, and that can even promote fire within their environment. There are some fire neutral or inhabited plant communities, or inhibited, sorry, plant communities. And one of those plant communities that's actually inhibited or negatively affected by fire is the desert, which I just mentioned. So some fire neutral plants are fire resistant, and some are fire damaged. So we're going to kind of talk about all of these things next. Let's look at resisting fire damage. So some ways that native plants in California can resist fire damage is by having really, really, really thick bark. And it's also usually very high in tannins. So a redwood tree or a giant sequoia would be excellent examples of plants that can resist fire damage because they have very, very thick bark. If you look at that upper center photo, there's a bunch of native plants called geophytes. Basically, they store a bunch of their energy in underground root-like structures. So think of bulbs, or think of things like potatoes, you know, and corms, where they have an underground storage structure, and they can resist fire damage just because they're underground and they're insulated from the fire. If you look at the upper right photo, there's some foliage that can resist fire, and this would be plant foliage that has a really high moisture content. So think of things like succulents. One of the succulents you might have seen in California news in the last year or so is a group of plants called dudleyas. They're succulent, and at least here they grow in really coastal communities like coastal sand dunes and sea bluff scrubs. They've been in the news because people are poaching them and selling them overseas, but they're one of those plants that's got a thick succulent leaf that's native that could resist fire damage. If you look at the lower right hand photo, this is a look at quaking aspen leaves in the foothills and the lower elevations of the Sierra Nevada. They grow in meadows and they have rapid foliage decomposition. There's just so much moisture within their environment that they decompose very quickly. So there's just a lot of moisture there. And so that's one way that they can resist fire damage. It's just a very high moisture content and rapid decomposition. And then that lower center photo is looking at branch habit. Branch habit is whether a tree or a shrub retains its lower branches or whether it's what we call self-pruning, where it drops its lower branches. And quite a few trees and like forested plant communities that evolved with frequent low intensity fire have this kind of branch habit. So again, this would be like a redwood or a sequoia and a variety of other coniferous species across the California landscape. When they have evolved to drop their branches, it's a way that they have evolved over time to survive fire by helping to keep the fire down on the ground so it doesn't climb up all those branches and kill the top of the tree. So just having a certain type of self-pruning branch habit can help them resist fire damage. Then there's a bunch of plant adaptations that help plants recover from fire damage. Now, again, this isn't for all plants in California, but a lot of plants have this or these types of adaptations. If you look at the upper left photo, that's looking at lignotubers. It's kind of a, just at the surface and below the surface of the ground where the plant meets the ground. It's this root crown storing structure that holds a bunch of apical meristems, or basically, new points of potential growth for that plant, and they're just waiting to be triggered by fire. So what you can see here is a manzanita species as well as a samish species. They're in two different plant families, and they are able to sprout from the root crown or the lignotuber after fire. And fire is like a heat and chemical cue that helps the plant do this, basically activate those apical meristems or potential spots of growth in the plant. If you look at the two photos on the upper right, this is showing stem and stump sprouting. So certain California oaks can do this as well as coniferous species. If the branches burn, a coast live oak can actually sprout from those stems, from basically the growth areas or meristems along the stem tissue. And then the lower photo is looking at sprouting from root crowns, like with the redwood tree, and even a native California species, a bunch grass called Nacella pulchra. That picture is from one of our prescribed fire plots here on the Central California coast. Some plants don't sprout, but they can colonize with seeds over a burned area. And this can go with wildfires as well as prescribed fires. So some plants are sprouters and some are seeders. Basically, they have seeds that are dormant in the seed bank and they are waiting for the heat and chemical cues of the fire and smoke, maybe even some scarification to help break their seed coat so they can absorb water with the next rain and then germinate. Some plants can, who are fire followers, can have their seeds dormant in the seed bank for over 100 years until a fire comes through. And here's just looking in the left three photos of some cedars that are, triggered by fire in particular, as well as heat or smoke. Looking at the light windborne seeds of the willow tree in the upper right-hand photo, we can see that some plants just have small wind-dispersed seeds, and so that can help them colonize a burned over area. They're not necessarily, seeds with hard seed coats waiting in the seed bank buried down in the soil for fire to activate them, but they are just gonna blow in that freshly burned over area and colonize that way. And then this is a particularly interesting topic for a fire ecologist and a dendrologist such as myself. There's certain conifers that have what we call a serotinous cone. A serotinous cone stays closed until the radiant and convective heat of a fire can basically loosen the waxes and the resins that hold those cone scales together and open up that cone so that the seeds can drop to the forest floor. These are again called serotinous cones, and typically these tree species are used to a stand replacing fire, where it's very high intensity, very high severity. The forest floor burns, the canopy burns, all the mature trees die, but their cones are opened, releasing seeds into that very, very fertile new soil surface layer with all those increase in nutrients, and there's no competition for water or sun, so they're able to germinate and you have a whole new baby forest forming underneath. So this is a way to colonize over a burned over area by use of serotinous cones. This picture, incidentally, actually all of these pictures are from Montana de Oro State Park and our Bishop Pine Forest and our high elevations of the Coon Creek watershed, where we have done some prescribed burns to help the Bishop Pines recover and regenerate. All right, so some plants actually promote fire in their environment, and there's a lot of ways that they can do that. On the left-hand side, you can see some eucalyptus trees, not native to California. They're native to Australia and New Zealand. And you can see that they have really shreddy, flammable bark. I included them because we do have a lot of eucalyptus plantations across the California landscape. This is a plant that both in chemical content and in the structure of its bark promotes fire in the landscape. It has evolved with fire over time. And those plants that have that high chemical content and really flammable bark have encouraged fire to climb up the trunk of the tree into the upper canopy. So it's a flammable bark in both chemical content and the structure of that peeling bark. Some plants, like in this upper center photo, it says the California native black sage, have really high, like highly flammable foliage. And again, that's because of the chemical content. It's the thing that makes the sage bush smell so good, but it's also really encouraging fire within a landscape. And then the retention of foliage. So unlike those plants that can kind of resist fire intensity by dropping their branches, there's some trees that retain those branches, encouraging the fire to go from the surface, where those surface fuels are, up through the branches that are basically what we call ladder fuel into the top of the tree. So the retention of foliage in a tree can help encourage or promote fire within the environment. All right, so that was a big kind of overview on plant adaptations and plant effects with fire. I'd like to talk now about animals, because I think that this is one of the things that people are really concerned about when a big fire or sweeps through the environment, or when we light prescribed fires. Again, we don't have bison here native in California, but I just love this picture because you can see the bison in Yellowstone grazing with fire very close to them, and they do not seem concerned. So the point with this photo is that animals have evolved with fire over time. And I think that it's just interesting to see how unconcerned about this fire these bison are. So many North American animals have evolved in a fire environment. Most will flee or seek refuge, and they have the ability to do that from flying or from running or from going down into a burrow. Other species are actually attracted to burning areas. So we know that insects and like reptiles, like snakes and lizards, are attracted to heat. So sometimes we'll see snakes and lizards and insects kind of going closer towards the fire environment because of the actual heat that is comforting to them. Other animals are attracted to burning areas because they know as predators, they can feast on all the fleeing prey. The species composition of the animals in a fire environment will change. So just like there's change over time in the plant communities, again, that's called succession, we'll see species composition changes to early successional fauna assemblage of animals. And then eventually the rest of the animals will come back in as the area recovers. So really, an animal's ability to survive a fire depends on quite a few things. And again, this photo is from Africa, so not from California, but that is a massive wall of flame in the background, and none of those animals seem to be too concerned. So I just am trying to emphasize that point, that animals are actually used to this, and their ability to survive depends on a few things. The intensity of the fire, so its rate of spread and the heat that's put off by that fire. The seasonality of a fire. I think a good way to think about this is if you're a bird that's got a nest in a tree and you're incubating those eggs, and a fire comes through, you might be able to flee, but all the energy in those baby birds and the eggs, they can't flee. And so your population might get impacted if a bunch of bird nests are burned up. Or with small mammal population, we really see their population explode every year in the fall. And so if there's a fire that's covers a large spatial extent in the fall, that can impact small mammal populations. So the seasonality of the fire is a big thing. Where are you with your reproduction and your locomotion? Your mobility is actually a really important thing. Are you able to seek shelter? Can you run? Can you get into a burrow? Or are you, a salamander that only lives in the tops of redwood trees, and you can't really go anywhere, right? Because your whole world is in the top of that redwood tree. Your habitat requirements also affect your ability to survive. So I think the salamander and the redwood tree is a really great example of that. What's your placement in the environment? Do you move through your environment, or are you fixated in a very specific location? Like maybe just that pool of a creek, right? Then if that's your whole world, it's going to be very hard for you to escape. Maybe you have a physiological avoidance. Some animals can completely shut down and they can insist, you know, their eggs can insist. And so physiologically, they're going to have different avoidance mechanisms. Some animals don't have any at all and they have to just flee or they're not going to make it. This is a really great picture from a research article looking at animals and the effect that fire has on them. Now, obviously, we're not going to see all of these animals sharing a burrow together, but it's just, this picture is showing you that a bunch of animals can seek refuge in a burrow. Their burrow depths are going to be different depending on the species. And you'll notice how insulating the soil is from the heat of the fire. The farther down you go, the more insulated you are from the heat. Now, smoke can still get into your burrow system, but you're going to be insulated from the heat. So this is just a really great picture kind of showing you how the temperature changes as you go farther down into the soil and subsoil environment. Don't know if everyone remembers, but you know, before our fires started, it was this same year that Australia was on fire for about 200 and something days. And there was news articles and it was all over social media about how wombats had these very huge, extensive burrow systems, and they were finding that other animals had sought refuge in the wombat burrow system or warrens. So this might kind of trigger you on that as well. All right, so let's look at mammalian populations in particular. The picture in the background here is from the Yellowstone fires when I was much, much younger, and it's showing some deer or elk, I believe, seeking refuge in a river. And that's one way is that animals can survive. One of the things that's really great about fire for animals is the subsequent vegetation regeneration. We know a lot of California plants regenerate very quickly and very well after the fire. And it's one of the reasons why Native Americans used fire on the landscape. They used it to protect their communities by burning out around their communities. They used it to encourage certain plants that thrived in the post-fire environment that they needed for textiles. They used it to help keep their pests and pathogens down in their oak woodlands and in their coniferous forests, where they relied so heavily on food resources. And they also use fire to encourage vegetation regeneration, which would then draw in a bunch of mammals, herbivores in particular, that would be attracted to that new, healthy green growth on the plants. So we see a lot of vegetation regeneration that benefits the herbivore population. This comes in the form of seed availability and actual like leaves and grass and that kind of green material, the vegetative material, as well as the fruits that are produced off the flowers. And then we also know that in addition to this vegetation helping the prey species that are herbivores, predators are going to follow the prey. So if the mice and the rabbits and the deers are rebounding really, really well, then the large predatory animals are going to rebound well also. A really great example of this is that elk are attracted to burned areas for the new vegetation, and the wolves follow the elk. Fire effects on birds is pretty interesting, and I love this photo in the background, and I kind of want to draw your attention now to some articles that came out of Australia about these kites. It's a type of predatory bird. There's a bunch of different kites in the world, and in Australia, they have these kites that not only follow fires, but actually try to increase the fire within their environment. So we're going to talk about birds, and then I'm going to bring this back to those kites. So many birds are attracted to burned areas, both during the fire, as you see things fleeing, so they can eat prey that's fleeing, as well as to the post-burned environment, because again of all the vegetation and the flowers. And so the pollen drinking birds, such as hummingbirds, do really, really well. We see that predators and scavengers are attracted to the immediate post-burned environment because there's other dead things for them to eat. Woodpecker populations tend to thrive when you get trees burnt out because there's better snag habitat. So you're going to see an increase in things like termites and woodborne insects, which the woodpeckers use as a primary food source. Hummingbirds, again, I've mentioned, they're going to thrive because of all the fire-following flower species. And some of these species are even dependent on fire. So here's a look at a woodpecker on a burned out snag. And then here's the kites in Australia. And the thing that I love about this story is that a bunch of researchers in the last 5 to 10 years, and you can find published papers on this online if you do a Google search or a Google Scholar search, have actually watched and documented these kites picking up burning embers from the fire, moving it out into the unburned grasses and fuels, and dropping those burning embers, and then foraging on the small mammals running between the two fire fronts. So they're actually using fire as a tool to hunt within their environment. I mean, it's just a really astonishing series of research articles that have come out of Australia looking at these kites. All right, so some effects on reptile populations. Again, reptiles are attracted to heat. So I think that they tend to suffer more on the actual fire event. Most of them do burrow so they can survive the fire. Again, those that are attracted to heat, some of them might get stuck because they can't get away soon enough. But many benefit from the scavenging opportunities after the fire and all the dead snails and insects and things like that. Speaking of insects, let's talk about fire effects on insects. So I think this picture is really great. This is a picture of a native California bulb or geophyte plant called blue dix. And this is in a post-fire environment, and it's looking at a butterfly that's nectaring on those flowers and that have recovered after the fire. So some individuals may die because they're just not good at fleeing as quickly as, let's say, a predatory bird or a mountain lion or a deer that can run really fast. They're very susceptible to air currents, and in the fire environment, there's a lot of hot air moving around in a very unpredictable way. But their populations are going to thrive in the post-fire environment as all those plants recover, because there's going to be so many nutrients released to the soil, plants that have sprouted, plants that have germinated from the seeds in the seed bank, and you're going to see a huge flush of flowers that you just haven't seen since the last fire. So typically, it takes a while, but insect populations tend to thrive. Some are susceptible to predation by birds and reptiles as they're fleeing, but for the most part, they do okay. So that's the end of the talk today. I wanted to kind of end with a question slide. I know you can email in and send questions to our YouTube live channel, and I'll try to get back to you on answers for those questions. But this last shot is from the Southern Sierra foothills, and it's looking at a post-fire environment in an oak woodland understory. And what I want to point out is just the amount of flowers there and the amount of new green up. So you can see the oak branches have resprouted, nice fresh green leaves, and you can see a lot of grasses and flowers in the understory. This is a great environment for animals after the fire. So I'm going to end our talk there, and I encourage you to send in questions that I will be eagerly awaiting. And I hope you guys enjoyed the talk. All right, have a good one.